Meg, you did a really great episode of the Ringer F1 podcast talking about the life and legacy of Daniel Ricciardo, who we now know is officially no longer racing on the second Red Bull team, RB VCARB, whatever it's called. Liam Lawson is taking over for the rest of the season. We did talk a little bit after Singapore about how we thought that was the end, but now we know for sure confidently that was indeed the end, at least of this chapter. Maybe he'll be back in some other team someday. But okay, first of all, I want to talk about how weird it was that Red Bull did it all this way. And you talked on your show about it. And what was your sort of takeaway about this whole weird process of Red Bull sort of like firing and demoting him mid-season?
Yeah, I wish I was more surprised by it, but I think Red Bull just sort of does things the way that they want to do without much regard for anyone else's feelings about the matter. It was really sad to see them sort of do this to Daniel Ricciardo off screen. I was hoping we would get at least 1 week where he got to take a victory lap and really do all the interviews and talk about his career and have some certainty around it. We got that a little bit in Singapore, but it was more sad, I think, because it was all rumors at that point that he seemed to be having to process in real time, and he was getting asked about it, in front of cameras and was getting really emotional after the race. He stayed in his car for a little bit longer, and when they asked him about that, he looked down for a bit and almost seemed like he was crying because he wasn't sure if this was going to be his last time in a Formula One car. I really wished that we got the full Daniel Ricciardo experience. I understand why they did it when they did it, to give Liam Lawson, that 3 week break to kind of get acclimated and things before Austin, but also doing it before Austin felt a bit like a slap in the face because Daniel Ricciardo is like the mayor of that place at this point, and to not have him on the grid for that is really genuinely upsetting.
Our honorary Texan out.
Yeah.
Like, I thought they would at least give him one last ride. Like, he kind of got his one last ride with the fastest lap, but now there's not an American on the grid.
Right.
Not even one. You know how Dua Lipa was wearing a Texas jersey last week on stage?
Mm-hmm.
Daniel Ricciardo needed to have that moment where he just swoops into the Georgia Texas game after the sprint race and gets to wear a Texas #1 jersey on the sideline.
It was just like so perfect for him, and yet not. Has there been anyone who's had a more sort of tumultuous calendar year? Because he had an adventure from June to July where he was named Red Bull's replacement after being the third driver, and now is out. So he went from being unemployed to third driver to seat to losing the seat to podcaster. Like, he underwent like a good 5 career steps in the span of a single year.
And even once he had that seat, right, there were the rumors over the summer break, like, will he be replacing Checo? Will Red Bull decide to demote him? So, like, even when he was in RB, it wasn't set that that was where he was going to stay. And it seemed like it went from, well, now apparently we know, or Helmut Marko has said since that, oh, I've been wanting to replace him since Spain, which I was like, what? Since when? Why was this not public information when this was a thing you were considering over the summer break, potentially replacing Checo, and whether that was going to be Daniel or someone else? He's lived many, many lives over the last year, as you said, and it's sad that he went through that full Red Bull roller coaster and was such a champ about everything, and then still kind of got shafted in the end.
I feel like we always talk about how Max Verstappen is a full-time sim racer and a part-time F1 driver, but I feel like Helmut Marko is a full-time podcaster and part-time works for Red Bull because he just talks. Like, he talks so much and he says so much stuff where you're like, are you allowed to say that? Sometimes like genuinely offensive things as well. And so, yeah, the comment about him wanting to kick Ricciardo out by Barcelona was definitely surprising. That was on the F1 Nation podcast. But yeah, Liam Lawson coming in is going to have a few weeks, I guess 6 races to kind of like prove himself or prove something, while the rest of the Red Bull drivers, not named Max Verstappen, are like sort of in this weird Red Bull limbo. So I guess like what should we actually expect of Liam Lawson over these next 6 races? Because obviously it's great that he's getting the experience, but it's kind of a tough spot to put someone in this late in the season.
Yeah, I mean, it's odd. We saw, I think, 5 races from him last year when he was filling in for Daniel after that broken wrist in Zandvoort. And he did pretty well. I think he had 1 points finish and two, like, 11th place finishes. He didn't end his stint incredibly well, but I think he showed a lot. And I think Red Bull is obviously very eager to give him the opportunity to show more. I don't believe he's officially locked into that second seat yet, or at least I don't think they've announced it. I know he has some weird clauses in his contract where they had to secure him, I think, something for 2025, or else he was able to sort of freelance and find something else. So I would assume there's something going on there, whether it's for RB or, the Red Bull proper team. But I'm excited to see what he's able to do. I think, he's been around the team pretty consistently for over a year now, and shouldn't have any excuses about getting out there and putting in some fast times, hopefully.
Except for a grid penalty.
Yeah.
That they will be starting with. Which
that's true.
Isn't that how you want to do that? Like, that's the most like V-carb way to start this, is to go, yes, congratulations. You have all of the pressure in the world, and your boss is the most famously cutthroat driver evaluator in all of F1. Compare, if you will, what Helmut Marko says about drivers, treating them basically like stock horses, right? Like, oh, that's okay. We'll just send that one to the glue factory. We'll trade.
Oh no,
and
not
then
the glue factory.
Yeah, I mean, that may be kind compared to what Helmut Marko has talked about with it. Like, for instance, called Liam Lawson, correct? Called Liam Lawson at 6 a.m. once to tell him that he wasn't shit. How many haters in this world are that dedicated that they would call you at 6 a.m., right?
Dan Batard. I'm just kidding.
Well,
he does text us at 4 a.m. constantly.
I think that speaks to what you're saying, though. Like, is Helmut Marko the most available person in Formula One these days? So, like if he's just up texting, like shit talking at 6 a.m. on like over text, like what else does the man have going on?
Oh man, yeah, that was another thing that was in the F1 Nation pod. Liam Lawson was just saying how like basically just how cutthroat it is to be in like the Red Bull Academy and just have these like constant like early phone calls and just like constant pressure all the time to be performing well all the time. But yeah, I'm with you, Meg. I expect him to like do what he did last season, finish closer to Tsunoda than Ricciardo has been lately. But it's definitely a sad and somber day for all of the Daniel Ricciardo fans out there, or at least it was when we officially got the news of this. You also talked on your show about his sort of like fan legacy and how he was like one of the big stars of the early Drive to Survive seasons, and that potentially his stardom, his like humor, his authenticity are all things that really helped propel that show forward, and also F1 in the US. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how you think he will be remembered by F1 fans if this is in fact the end of his time on the grid.
Yeah, so well, when the news came through, I was feeling in my feels and getting a little nostalgic, and I went back to rewatch episode 1 of Drive to Survive because I remembered him and Gunther Steiner being the stars of that season, of course. And Daniels is the first voice that you hear on the show. He is the first driver that you're introduced to. And he is really the first one that the show kind of like asks you to buy into and asks you to fall in love with. I'm sure you guys remember Mercedes and Ferrari didn't participate the first season, so you're losing the top 2 teams on the grid. You're not getting a Lewis Hamilton, which is probably the only driver that, if you weren't already a fan of Formula One, you might be familiar with. So yeah, I mean, he really seemed to buy into the show. I talked to one of the show's executive producers, and he was saying that like his buy-in and willingness to have these cameras, following him around, willingness to give interviews, to be open and vulnerable about things, to show his humor on camera was a big reason why that first season was such a success. And, they weren't necessarily guaranteed a ton more access, but I think with the success of that first season, that's what got Mercedes and Ferrari to be willing to participate. That's what sort of opened up the door for the series as a whole. And I think it's one of the reasons he's as big in the US as he is. The executive producer had said that Daniel has a home in LA, and before that he could basically be unrecognizable around Los Angeles, which was one of his favorite parts about being there. And within a few months of the show having run, he was like, I was getting stopped in coffee shops everywhere people recognizing who I am. So it certainly seems like it changed things for Daniel and for Drive to Survive too.
Please appreciate how in that first season, y'all, the most important racing entities in Formula One were, according to the show, if you weighted it by access, Renault and Haas. That's it. If you'd only watch the show, you'd be like, Renault and Haas, they have to be the most important entities in all of the sport.